It's my pleasure to welcome you here and to introduce Chris Reed. Over the last 15 years, Chris has established himself as among the most important young voices in the field of landscape architecture nationally and internationally. His firm, Stoss Landscape Urbanism, first came to my attention, and I think to the attention of many of us, through its commitment to an intellectual agenda associated with landscape urbanism. And since that time, Chris and his team at Stoss have built, in addition to their base here in Boston, a new office in Los Angeles, and a range of really very early built work that I think are quite significant projects. Among those early built projects, you will have seen waterfront projects, public work in Green Bay, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and more recently, the Science Center Plaza at Harvard University. Chris will share with you some of those projects and also some other work in the firm's recent history this evening. Chris began his work doing undergraduate work at Harvard College in urban studies, did his graduate degree at the University of Pennsylvania, and following that went into a series of notable apprenticeships, including work with George Hargraves, among others. In addition to his professional activities, Chris has maintained a commitment to teaching, and it's through his teaching and through his research that I think his work really first manifests itself for national and international recognition. He is Associate Professor of Practice in Landscape Architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's also taught and lectured widely around the world at notable institutions. He's recently been quite productive in scholarship, co-editing a volume, Projective Ecologies, that many of you may be familiar with Nina Marie Lister. That volume has been, I think, quite consequential in extending the discourse on landscape urbanism and ecological urbanism that Chris and his firm have contributed to quite significantly. In spite of the relative youth of Chris and his firm, they have received numerous awards and honors over the course of the last several years. The Topos International Firm of the Year Award, the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Award. He's been named a Fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and he is most recently resident at the American Academy in Rome. For me, I guess what I would leave you with by way of introduction is when I see the work, both the intellectual project but equally the built work, the work really manifests for me a range of qualities that I've now come to associate with Chris himself. On the one hand, it's wicked smart. It's also incredibly funny. It exhibits a very tough, urbane, hard edge, but underneath there's a deep, deep, compassionate generosity. Please welcome Chris Reed.
Thanks, man. Terrific. Good evening. Thanks, Charles, for such a nice introduction and for extending the invitation to begin with. Really appreciate being part of what has become a really significant lecture series in Boston that looks at landscape and design really broadly. So it's really an honor to be part of that. Thank you to Peggy and the museum for hosting this. It's a wonderful venue, and it's really nice to be here. And I too want to thank Joanne for all the help and assistance that really allowed all of this to happen. These are my kids, 15, 13, and 9. And I show you them because the same month he was born, I started Stoss 15 years ago. And we've taken that occasion to just kind of step back a little bit and reflect, figure out, like you do with a kid who's 15 entering high school, like, what is this thing, right, that we've created? And how do we begin to think about our relationship to this thing moving forward? So it's been, the last 6 months have been deeply reflective, both on a personal and professional level. These are my kids goofing off. Except for him, that's the look of a 15-year-old boy every day of the year, right? Like, seriously, Dad, what are you doing? The firm itself, you know, in some ways is still young. It's quite energetic. It's very collaborative. In a lot of ways, it's a practice generated from ideas and centered on design. And in other ways, it's a hybrid studio informed and cross-pollinated by research, experimentation, and teaching. And you're seeing some of the folks that we work with every day. But within this sort of reflective stage, I've had a moment, an opportunity to kind of be really reflective about some of the fundamentals of what it is we do as a landscape practice in contemporary society. Recently, I was asked to come into my kids' 7th grade class. They were doing a garden project, and they put out a call for landscape architects who could assist the kids with making a garden. And so I was the only one available, so they were stuck with me. And they asked me, could you give the kids the basics of what plants in a garden need? And I thought, oh shit, what do plants in a garden need to grow, right? So I got one of my interns, and we did some research together. And we started to think, what are the basics, like light, air, water, soil? The magic four. Talking about fundamentals at other levels, too, and in other parts of my life. As Charles mentioned, I teach. For the last 6 or 7 years, I've been teaching in the core studio courses at Harvard, where we really start to think about and talk about what are the fundamental skills, perspectives, and approaches that we want our students entering this world with. And it's been a great experience. It forces you to be critically reflective, not just on behalf of the students, but on behalf of the work that we too are doing back at the office. And it's also a question of, we've been thinking a little bit more about what informs the work that we do. What are the everyday experiences? Whether it's experiences with art, this is a sculpture by Do-Hoo Soo called Karma in front of the Albright Knox Museum in Buffalo. I was there on Tuesday. Looking at this amazing sculpture out of bronze that's probably 20 feet high. What are those cultural experiences? What are those artistic touchstones? And even what are some of the everyday landscapes that we experience and that have an impact on the way we work and think? These are actually photographs from a kind of blog I keep on Instagram whenever I run or bicycle. And I kind of keep this blog as a way to kind of record what I'm doing. I've had certain colleagues ask me, you seem to be running a lot, you're doing a lot of biking, are you having a midlife crisis or something, or having an affair? And I say, I don't know, I don't think so. But it's a way to kind of keep me in touch with what's happening. More broadly, when I started the firm, I asked this bigger question: how might landscape play a more prominent and formative role in the imagining and remaking of public spaces, infrastructures, and entire cities? We live in an era of climate change. We live in an era of some levels of social, cultural upheaval. There are real social equity issues out there. And the question for us is, how can landscape play a role? Landscape not as a decorative art, but landscape as something that's really formative to the thinking and making of cities across the world. The ways in which I've attacked that problem are quite broad. Charles gave me an opportunity a few years back to really to write a paper that really rethinks the role of public and civic infrastructure and the way that landscape can help diversify what had been monofunctional infrastructures into something that had ecological and many social lives to it. And of course, this isn't new. Olmsted did this here in Boston, and he did it across the United States. How is it that landscape plays these multiple roles? If you look at the Back Bay Fens and the lower right image here of the Muddy River, first, you can see the extensive renovation that occurred. This is not nature. This is a designed, created landscape. But it's a landscape that not only is there for pleasure and recreation, it's flood control, it's transit, it's transportation, it's new habitat, right? It's performing environmental services, it's performing social surfaces, it's laying out new roadways and really structuring new neighborhoods. So in that way, it's very much an urban project. And I think the work that we're trying to do is recover a bit of that role, but tune it toward issues that are very, very contemporary now. We do this in a number of formats, in a number of ways, often working in the public realm. Project nearby in New Bedford, Massachusetts, small public space within a downtown district. We had the opportunity to work with the design and expansion team here a few years back on some of the landscapes associated with the new building. We're doing that for private development projects that have a significant public realm component, and we're doing that at the scale of very, very large city developments. So this is an issue that we can start to address in multiple ways at multiple scales, depending on the opportunities that come before us. And even this clip from some work we did a few years ago in Detroit starts to talk to the multiple functions that landscape can play. From an economic standpoint, to a community and neighborhood standpoint, to environmental standpoints as well. So a few projects that start to demonstrate these. This is a competition project in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, one of the few competitions we've actually won. We tend to take second place a lot. Charles has been on the jury of 2 projects that we got second place for. And he heard about it extensively. This was a small project in the industrial port of Milwaukee, and I will give him credit. He was on the jury. He happened to be on the jury for this one. Old industrial site right across from a sewage treatment plant, working port, but very much a denuded site. It had been filled, leveled, a lot of infrastructure, no ecological life, no social life in a place like this. And so the question was, how do we bring this site back to life, right? In many ways, environmentally, socially, et cetera. And we did it using a very simple series of manipulations, particularly of the ground plane. The plaza is really quite simple. You enter through a grove of poplars. The site is set up to actually capture all the stormwater and infiltrate it to the ground. As you move through the site starts to open up. You can see the very large scale of the boats that are moving through there, so it's still a working port, and we wanted to kind of acknowledge that kind of industrial legacy. But more importantly, the site steps down in a way to allow stormwater to gather at this lower location. And it's here that we replant a native marsh. So this is the same kind of marsh that used to occupy this space. It's been displaced by a lot of the industry and infrastructure that has grown up over time. And in this way now, that bulkhead wall that you see along the edge is protecting this newly established marsh from some of that industrial activity. So we're really taking a set of on-site resources to turn around a site and bring it back to life. The marsh has this amazing sequence and cycle. At every point of the year, it has a much different, vivid life to it. And this is something that people who are there can really feel and see. And so in a lot of ways, we're trying to reignite these environmental cycles in ways that are meaningful to people and in ways that people can really experience the kind of change that we're talking about. There's also a material play going on here between the old rusty steel of the bulkhead wall, the really soft and lush planting of the wetland, and then these new seating and light elements made out of fiberglass that gives a real contemporary feel and contrast to the other elements on site. And then the whole site becomes this amphitheater where the activity really is the river and the life of the river. And by doing this, we're improving the environment for the fish and making the fishermen around here a lot happier as well. So a lot of this interest in ecology, I had the opportunity to work with Nina Marie Lister, an ecologist and planner recently, and really dive deep into the academic thinking about it. We were looking at the relationship between ecological research and design thinking over the last 20 years, and also asking the question of where do we go now with it. One of the things that both designers and ecologists do is draw a lot. And we found a real overlap in their interests here. How is it that they begin to think about the changes in the environment? But for us as landscape architects, we're interested in how that hits the ground and how that can be used to really impact the way people live and the ways in which that people might experience the city. There's a piece of this project. This is a brand new project at the University of Michigan, 4 acres. This was the before. There were 3 paths across this quad where tens of thousands of students were active around it. And we were asked to reimagine the plaza, the grove, in a way to make it conducive to not only just the passing of people, but how is it that we can invite people in and give them a number of lush places where they might begin to just hang out and enjoy being outside and in being in the company of others. There's a small plaza in the middle, which is set up for flexible uses and activities. There are other elements to it. Volleyball, and even a swing set that has an illumination feature. We were hired here by the engineering school dean, and he had this very keen interest in how technology could be brought out to life. And I've got to say, he absolutely wanted a swing set. And so we got him a swing set that has this cool feature that'll be installed quite soon. There are also these custom designed benches. I'll talk a lot about furniture tonight. For somebody who started looking at landscape and the city and urbanism and big picture, we found ourselves becoming furniture designers in the process because of the ways in which we have an interest in how people begin to inhabit landscapes on the day-to-day level. So these are various drawings from that, how we put components together. You see a few images here, but just now, we're going to queue up a video that was released yesterday. This project opened yesterday. Not all of the elements are there. We can go ahead when you're ready. But we discovered this last night, and I thought I'd just share it with you because it's the most exciting documentation of what's been going on here. So that's the before. And then they've documented the whole construction progress. A project like this, there's a lot of dirt on site for years, and it's only in the last stages of project development that you start to see the real new piece start to emerge from the ground. So for us, this is a very exciting moment in terms of the ways in which now the student body there can really start to take advantage of this. The piece I wanted to show you, though, relative to ecology, is a piece that's being finished tonight. I have somebody on site. One of the requirements was to take all the stormwater from the site and collect it in infiltration gardens and make sure that it wasn't just being piped off. So there's a sustainability agenda there that the university asked us to deal with. And of course, rain gardens and stormwater gardens are becoming part of landscapes today. We wanted to take that a step further and really kind of play off of the dean's interest in how to use technology in the public landscape. And so for us, we began to think about the ways in which we might utilize lighting to register some of the stormwater cycles that might occur on site. You can see the garden here. This is one of 5 very big and deep, lushly planted. This is a tree that'll grow. This is a bald cypress tree that'll grow very quickly so that this will all fill in quite nicely. But the idea here is not to just use sustainability and ecology as a checklist, but to say how is it that we can use that to enhance the experience of people in places like this. So we've developed this environmentally responsive lighting feature so that every time water enters these gardens, a series of lights within the garden will start to flicker. And so just that moment where it's raining and a little bit miserable and you're usually wanting to run into a building, there'll be one of the most beautiful moments in the entire project be brought to life. These are a sample of the lighting fixtures themselves. We're calling them reed lightings. And Tim is out there tonight doing the test on these lights to make sure that we've got the flickering effect right. So unfortunately, it's not late enough out there. We do have a live feed. They're not quite at work yet. If I take too long, we might be able to go to the live feed. Charles is giving me a dirty look, so I won't take too long. For us, though, the ecological piece isn't just environmental, it's social as well. How is it that we can design spaces that are flexible, that are adaptive, that offer diversity and choice to people so that there are opportunities for public spaces to have lives of their own, different kinds of lives, different kinds of moods at different times of day, different times of the year. This, of course, is a student in our plaza at Harvard. I love this guy. He doesn't care what you think, right? I mean, this is a project in Green Bay. He's just out there to enjoy the sun and enjoy being himself. You know, like these ladies. I mean, they could have eaten in the cafe. They could have eaten at the outdoor cafe tables, but they said, no way, we want our own space, right? And really understanding that people sometimes just want to figure it out for themselves. How do you design for people who want to figure it out themselves? I think there's a lightness to it. And actually, this goes back to something I learned as we started having kids. As we'd walk up and down the street with our kids when they're young, kids will find anything to play with. They don't know that that's a drain cover, right? What they see is a thing. And as they go up the street, they make a game out of hopping from thing to thing, right? No matter what you put in front of them, it's a prompt for them to discover, to explore their curiosity. And we began to use this idea in some of the early garden installations that we did. This was up at Grand Métis, Quebec, the Jardin du Métis. And this is a annual garden festival where they do a whole series of garden installations. Our idea was simply to take, you know, that rubber surface in public playgrounds, which is really quite squishy. And actually, the thicker you make the subsurface, the squishier it is. It's really kind of fun to start to bounce on. And so we took this and created an undulating topography and just opened it to people to see what they do. Right? How is it that you confront a kind of foreign, unknown environment and then use that for play and exploration? Kids were great at it, of course. They'll just go out there and do something. Sometimes adults had to be nudged in, pushed in occasionally. The construction director would often beg people to take their shoes off so they can really feel the sensation on their feet. But it was a way that we began to explore ideas of free play, abstract form, and how you can begin to design without absolutely scripting every moment that people will spend there and every activity that they will do. That same kind of thinking we applied to the design of the Science Center Plaza at Harvard. We had a tricky site. This is historic Harvard Yard. That's the North Campus. This is a road that was sunken. And then you have this crossing area. And as much as there's a tent in the middle of that, the space really wasn't used for a whole lot of anything, partly because it looked like this. I mean, there's no real reason for you to want to be there. It was cold, it was windswept, there was hardly any seating, there was nothing to do, and the site was pretty worn out. The fact that grass was there on a bridge covering without adequate air, soil, water, meant that it was a pretty worn down place. We were asked by the president to remake this as the center of social life on the university campus. So how is it that we can begin to think of this forlorn place as the new space that everybody wanted to be at? And so we went through a very detailed design exploration with the university and with the city, and with a whole bunch of regulatory people looking in on us, because of course we're in a historic district with Harvard Yard, we're on a bridge, there are all these technicalities with water and structure and all this other stuff, and yet it had to be the center of Harvard's new campus. Of course, we had to first accommodate all the people moving back and forth, students, faculty, and others associated with the university, visitors going to the museums, and also residents that were passing through either on foot or in bicycles. So we needed to keep those pathways open. But for us, it was about how do you create a space that's conducive for everyday use, right? Not just when there's an event or activity, but just for the everyday when people are walking through. How can we beckon people to stay? That's where seating comes in. Just giving people the opportunity to sit, the offer to sit, the invitation to sit is part of what this project is. And here we're doing it using two features. One of them are these custom designed benches. Now they look kind of funny, but actually they're designed in order to accommodate our different bodies. I mean, if you look in the first row here, everybody has a different body type. You're slouching, you're sitting up fairly straight, right? You're very proper. You're very straight. But the whole idea is that you want to sit and, I'm sorry, you can still slouch, it's all right. The whole idea is that people have different moods, they have different body types, and we need to find a way to accommodate those choices. Some people want to lie down like that guy. Some people want to sit in a group. Some people want to sit alone. So these benches are designed actually to accommodate a number of different seating positions and really offer people choice and flexibility about how they use those. They're also great when you have little kids who can now sit face to face with you. They're also great for scratching your belly at lunch, I guess. And then kids, too, will use them as playthings. They're illuminated at night to kind of beckon people to the space at night as well. It's a very simple element, and then matched with just movable tables and chairs. So if you can't find the right spot on the benches, you can always move a table around to accommodate what it is that you want to do. Beyond that, we have a main active space, and then we've designed these quiet gardens off to the side, lush green gardens that give people opportunities for small groups, for lunches, for study groups, that sort of thing. And these are all, again, fed by some of the stormwater that we're collecting off of the site and sequenced so that the planting really has a dramatic change from season to season. But in many ways, the whole idea is first have a space that people can use for any kind of activity they want on a day-to-day use, and then to think about all the different kinds of events and activities that might happen on an occasional basis there as well. So the second part of the brief was to design this flexible space that allowed for the accommodation of things like crafts fairs and farmers markets and little tented activities and formal performances, boxing matches from the student club, ice skating, curling for curling enthusiasts, installations. This was just after the Boston Marathon, so it became a place of celebration and remembrance. It's also a place of student protest, so in that sense it really functions as a public civic space where everybody can have their say. And in this all, we're starting to think intellectually about the ways in which we script and draw these activities out. So for us, it's about this relationship between being very thoughtful and academic on the one hand, and yet really designing places that bring places to life for people in many, many different ways. Even the design of the crash wall, which prevents trucks from hopping over the edge, is civilized to accommodate seating, signage, wayfinding, and even bike parking. So in all of these ways, it's how is it that you create flexible, diverse spaces, a new set of social ecologies in the public realm. Project that extends that further and really actually gets to some serious issues about what do you do in neighborhoods who historically have positioned with having to take all the dirty industry from a city. This is 24 acres in Louisville, Kentucky, West Louisville. It's a neighborhood with a lot of minority populations, former industrial site here. The project, though, is a food port. We're working with OMA out of New York on this project. And it has a real set of interesting agendas. It's about food processing, food distribution, food retail. It's about food education, demonstration farms, employing or at least training some of the folks from the neighborhood so that we're offering jobs to folks who need jobs. And also offering them the kind of training that they can use to kind of start to build businesses of their own. So here, landscape is performing other kinds of roles that go beyond just the experiential or the purely decorative. We're taking some of those activities and bringing them front and center out into the landscape, into what's a very kind of playful landscape. For us, There's been a lot of earnestness, I think, in the work that we've done. This was an opportunity to kind of sit back and have a little bit of fun, in part because the building was so simple and cheap. That there was an interest both on behalf of the architects and the client and ourselves to really make the landscape as vivid as possible. So how is it that we combine food activities and art and culture and bring them to life in relevant ways? How is it that we draw on the history of the site, this is tobacco, to begin to think through patterning? How is it that we use structures within the landscape to grow food, in this case hops for beer? But how is it that we might think about the landscape as being populated with fruit, nut, and food-bearing vegetation, both as a way to bring that site to life, but also as a way to educate urban dwellers about how to raise food within the city, particularly important in neighborhoods like this, which are considered food deserts. There's no fresh food available to these populations for many miles around. And so, you know, it was nice to work with OMA and to have a client who was really interested in the cultural aspect of it as well. So it wasn't just solving a food problem, but it was also bringing a higher level of culture and performance and social gathering and activity to that space. The main plaza is a riff on an orange slice. You can see it quite clearly there. It's an orange plaza. It's got a lot of slices to it. It's really set up for all sorts of activities and performance in association with an amphitheater in the building. But the wagon wheel, or the slices, we've designed really as different kinds of landscapes. So depending, again, on your mood, you can pick your piece of landscape pie and occupy that space. So you can have a plaza-like environment, you can have a bouncy rubber-like environment, you can have a soft rolling landscape with pretty trees, you can have a wood deck to kind of hang out and bake in the sun if you want, or a little garden. And so all of these are sort of arranged as a wheel. You can run from one to the other, or hop around as you will. There are also elements of demonstration farm as well, working with the County Extension School, again to show people how is it that you raise food on potentially dirty sites within the city. And how is it that we can elegantly include things like pawpaw trees. Pawpaw trees bear these really big fruit. And aren't used in production now, but were a huge food source throughout the Midwest and Northeast many, many years ago. So how is it that we can recover some of those uses within the landscape? Other projects that do a lot of other things. This one, we were asked by the architecture critic of the LA Times to rethink a segment of highway. Highways, of course, separate communities, reduce pollution. We wanted to kind of turn that idea on its head and really reimagine the highway as a social connector and as a social environmental machine, even with some kind of kitschy LA-style signage to go along with it. This is a project that really takes traffic off of the highway and converts it so that the highway itself is used to collect water rather than shed water. And then it has all these elements in it which perform various functions. So we can capture moisture from the air and collect that in the fog fence, things that harvest dew, solar shades which generate energy as opposed to use fossil fuels, other filters that actually clean some of the smog from the air from nearby automobiles, absorbing paving. Every bad thing that a highway does, we wanted to turn on its head as a speculative project and really just create a kind of spectacular, a little bit over the top experience in LA, and find ways then to use this elevated pathways, bike trails, community gathering spaces to then make connections with the ground and back to the LA River. A civic infrastructure on the waterfront in Green Bay, Wisconsin, project with an empty building, backs of buildings, parking lots. How is it that you start to bring new life, economic life, social life to a waterfront like this? This is a small city, 100,000 people. How is it that we begin to rethink the ways that people their and again, kind of give a nod to the ongoing work and industry that's there. The project, this is the center of downtown. It's a 1/4 mile long project, really quite modest, but every dark building was a new development project that came about as a result of the investment the city was making in the public infrastructure there. It's a very linear project. It's about promenading along the waterfront first, foremost, doing that on a warm wood deck. It also integrates regional bike trails, so there are lots of ways in which to get there. But it's a new front porch for the city, a way for people to just kind of hang out. This is an earlier project than the Harvard project. You can see we're manipulating furniture in similar ways, using different technologies here at different price points, but still trying to figure out how is it that we accommodate people's whims and moods in various bodies, whether or not they're there any day of the week or there for a bigger gathering or performance. So there are these a couple moments where you get a little elevation, and you can it's beautiful to watch the sunset. On the other hand, the real success of a public space is if you can get a spontaneous yoga class out there on some Monday morning. So success. It's also a place, again, where you can get really close to some of the industrial activity of the river. Other parts of the project bring you right down to the river, to a series of floating docks and walkways. So this was an experience that wasn't available to people. There was no way up, there was no way down. And here we wanted to create those connections for people. They're also looking at the activity, the building activity. We set the program and the building elevations for some of the new development, so these things would work together. Rather than having an architect do it, this was a project being led by landscape, so that activity then spills out into the public realm again. And then my favorite guy, he's actually hiding something. You can see we're elevating the level of the land here, in part to accommodate flood control. So there's a hidden agenda here. When that river floods, we've now protected the buildings right behind and provided a place to collect all the site stormwater so it infiltrates the ground through the slot in the bench, and also infiltrates, that's the slot that's been illuminated at night, also infiltrates the ground through this custom design paving. Now there's one thing, the mayor of Green Bay. Green Bay, of course, is known for the Green Bay Packers. It's kind of been the only thing that the city's been known for. And so the mayor was a little resistant to any nod to that. But there's something very subtle going on here. The pavers are actually green in color, and all the trees in the fall during football season will turn a bright gold. And the one way we snuck something in a very elegant way, where the mayor kind of rolled his eyes but said, okay. And it's really become the center of community life there. So this was a mayor who was interested in economic development, but realized he had to do that on the back of building community. And so he really invested a lot of time and energy, and has really created this amazing space for the city, for people to really come down and enjoy each other's company, no matter what season it is, even in very, very cold Green Bay. All right, the final project I want to show you is in Dallas, Texas. This too was a competition project we won. It was a competition we won. There was no prize, and there wasn't really a project at the end of it, although we've managed to squeeze out a few projects. So even when we win, we don't really win. I have a colleague, Nina Marie, actually, and I've talked to her about doing a book of all our losing competition entries. And I thought, initially, I suggested to her that we name it Second Place. And she said, no, just name it Loser. We'll see. Here, the project was interesting. This is downtown Dallas. The river, the Trinity River, used to exist here. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the river flooded downtown. So they decided, let's take that river and move it over here and put it in some embankments. And then about 20, 30, 40 years later, they decided, we really miss that river. So now let's reconnect to it. The problem is, in these 500 acres of land, this is the kind of stuff that grew up in the interim, right? So in a very short, relatively short distance between downtown and the river, really mere blocks if it had blocks, you had to get through that and that. Rail, lots of auto. Texas does highways like no one else does highways. I mean, they're really good at highways. And they're expanding that one, in the process of expanding it. It's also big levees that can make you feel really, really small. And so it's like, what do you do in a place like this, right? You can't just start laying out buildings and streets. It's like, what's going to allow you to transform this place over a period of 20, 30, 50 years? How do you deal with some of those really sticky issues of infrastructure? It's also a place that has donkeys, almost in the heart of downtown, right? This is a great place. It's a taco stand and a car wash and a pen for donkeys, longhorn steer, zebras, llamas. I mean, really, donkeys in the middle of, this is like the best mixed use project, Texas style, that I know about. And even fake buffalo. But the essential question is, how do you reconnect the city to the river? Our strategy here was really quite simple. It's not about drawing a path. It's saying, look, in areas where it's easy to develop, take those neighborhoods and simply extend them all the way to the edge of the river. And then use landscape in those harder areas where you have highway interchanges and a lot of infrastructure, and bring the landscape of the river directly to the footstep of downtown. So you get this kind of alternating grid green pattern. And what that does is it gives everybody direct access to landscape. So it's city neighborhoods absolutely situated within a kind of rich and lush and contemporary landscape. And that's both these new neighborhoods, and it's also giving access to some of the older neighborhoods there as well. And so this is the big overview. Grid green. You can see we're burying highway interchanges in lush forests, but the forests are active forests, so the forests can incorporate other things as well. Play and extreme sports, things that people want to do but can't do in some of the smaller public spaces within the city, but don't want to go far out of town in order to do these things. It's also a great opportunity. There's a great art culture down there. The idea that some of those institutions have art outreach programs, and we can use some of the bigger landscape to extend their mission to the general public, even using some of the highway interchanges as a nightclub occasionally at night. Part of this has to do with extending neighborhoods, rerouting, and beginning to imagine new transit connections. So while we're not taking the highways apart yet, we're setting up an urban fabric that allows people to walk or bike to work or take new transit connections to work. So gradually through time, starting to undo the car-oriented culture. This, a new transit plaza with the old train station and a new high-speed rail station right on the edge of downtown. But the real heart of the project is, how do we bring the old river back to life? There were remnants of this river there, and the question was, how is it that we can build some of these landscapes and neighborhoods around a revived and contemporary old river? That's what it looks like now. They're really stormwater ditches that collect a lot of trash. This is where all the stormwater from the city, with all its dirt and trash, is gathered before it's then pumped over the levee and into the main river. And so that's our starting point. Now, we had some inspiration from Pegasus. Pegasus, of course, is ExxonMobil, their symbol. But Pegasus, mythologically, was this winged horse where it would gallop along, and every time its hoof hit the ground, the myth was water would spring from that point. And so we brought Pegasus out and decided we could let him charge across the landscape and use this kind of mythological connection as a way to think through how we bring this old river back to life, and how we use it to then create these unique destinations at the heart of new neighborhoods. So The levee beach here, which allows for an opportunity for people to shed their inhibitions right in the middle of a mixed-use district, right on the edge of the river. A second neighborhood whose heart is a water amphitheater, the celebratory moment in the middle of a real high-density neighborhood to create new kinds of cultural opportunities and social opportunities for really big celebration right on the river again. And then a third neighborhood where we're really thinking about water and aviary gardens that ecologically and socially and culturally start to bring this neighborhood to life, not only by capturing some of the stormwater from the city, but also capturing local stormwater that falls on buildings and within the neighborhood fabric here. This is a project we finally did get to advance conceptually and is starting to go through some engineering review. So that is that denuded piece of the river that I showed you before, here totally redesigned in ways that really bring this to life. So we're working with engineers and ecologists to think through how is it that we have cleansing wetlands that bring the water quality up? How is it that we use landscape to begin to enhance that water quality to the point where we can actually bring people right down to the river? So that they can enjoy it. So a whole series of water gardens that form the heart of a new neighborhood with densities and economies more than what's possible now, simply because, again, of the investment that's being made here. But again, it's a place that's safely floodable. So the idea that when it does rain, the garden is designed to flood, and yet people can still go down there in a safe manner. And really enjoy this moment of this confluence of what's, a combination of natural rainwater and the runoff from the city. So I think with all these projects, at the core of the work is a dogged interest in the various ways in which landscape, living landscape, breathing landscape, operative landscape might play a more formative role in the reimagining and remaking of cities' public spaces and metropolitan regions in an era of climate change, rapid urbanization, social inequities, and cultural debate. Landscape, I believe, offers a profound and functional and inventive starting point for rethinking the ways we live. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks for that. I know there's not a lot of overlap between our programming here at the museum and the NFL season, but some of you will be making your way to this evening's football game, even though it's not involving the Packers. Will you take a question or two?
Absolutely.
Relative to this morning's front page of the Globe, is there any hope for City Hall Plaza?
There is. I didn't see the front page, so I can't comment on the project. I've seen pieces of it. But City Hall Plaza was one of these spaces when we were designing the Harvard Plaza that came up over and over again. That's a plaza that was designed essentially for very large-scale civic celebrations. And when the Patriots win a Super Bowl or you have a big tent, circus out there, it's perfectly sized for that. But it fails as an everyday space. And so for us, it became a touch point. We could always talk to the client about being able to talk through how is it that that space is successful, and when is it successful, and what are the many ways in which that isn't successful. What I understand about the work that's going on there now is they're not going to do a lot of physical redesign. It's about a kind of hyper-programming, if you will. And there's been an era, a kind of wave of work recently within the public realm where people are thinking about ways to activate public space, not by completely remaking the infrastructure of the place, but by adding food trucks, seating, that sort of stuff. to it. This is sort of a kind of amplified version of that, which relies on bigger scale program. I think, it may be a good test of what's possible, what the kinds of activities are that are possible there, but it's a project that ultimately really needs a physical redesign and reconsideration. It's been one that's been thought about many, many times over and over again. It's a technically complex project. It's got subway lines underneath, parking garages and all that. But look, there are great examples now of projects which take on that level of complexity. And so this, you might think of this as a testing phase, or let's optimistically say this is a testing phase for the city to begin to think what's possible there in ways that might lead to a real concerted effort to remake that place. It's about time, I think. Over here and then over here.
A number of your projects rely on what appears to be natural wood, both for hardscape and also for seating. I can understand all of the advantages of doing that. What kind of wood are you proposing or have you used? How much is the life expectancy of those structures?
Yep.
And what kind of maintenance have you done?
Yeah, sure. Huge question, particularly when you're in the public realm. We're doing a playground in Somerville, and we're looking at some fixtures for this playground. And we're actually taking, these reflectors that are embedded into highways that, in the lane. So we were taking that element and kind of stringing it out playfully as a kind of thing that kids could use to. And the client was really nervous about it and finally says, what happens if somebody comes with a sledgehammer to this thing? And I said, well, it'll probably break. You can break almost anything, but that's what they were hinting at, was this idea that it's in the public realm. People are going to do a lot of damage to it. So we've done a lot of research on this. When we did Green Bay, we specified certified Ipe wood. Ipe is a Brazilian tropical wood. There's a certification process that you go through to make sure you're not chopping down rainforests to do it. The advantage of Ipe is it's super hard and dense, like mahogany, but it's a tree that grows very quickly. So if it's sustainably harvested, you essentially can chop down the tree and then it'll resprout and regrow really quite quickly. So there is a certification process. What we found over time is, and I think a lot of other landscape architects have found this as well, is that it was really hard to find certified wood. This is a wood that would last 30 years, though. So more recently, at Harvard, this is an Alaskan yellow cedar, almost as dense and hard and tough. Now, it didn't come from Alaska. It's actually a tree that grows in many other places. Ours came from Cambridge. It happened to be leftover stock from the museum edition of the Harvard Art Museum. And as we were debating this question of what wood to use, we happened to be sharing a project manager with the project manager for the art museum, and he said, we have a bunch of extra wood. So the wood that's on the backside of that building, which is stained and worked in one way, is the same wood that we've used here in other ways. This wood, this is actually an interesting process where we're able to use a lot of new technology to cut the wood. So we develop these as design files that the fabricator then uses. Essentially, they take those files, put them into their own machines, and that's what starts to carve out the woods. It's also very easy. This is a system where you can take a rib out quite easily. Quite easily meaning you have a lift that lifts the thing up, you take it off. Every one of those things is numbered, so all the university has to do is reorder the number. And the only damage we've had here is from an errant snowplow driver. So every winter we lose 3 ribs and then get 3 new ribs in the spring.
You had a question?
Well, I have a suggestion about the title of your book.
Please.
What if?
What if? Yeah, I tell you, what if? What if, Charles? What if?
I have a question. I live in Austin, Narrow Necklace, and I actually because I walk there every day. They're constantly working on it. So it looks great because there's a lot of maintenance. And so it's connected to the previous question, how you maintain these public spaces in the cities, how you make sure that there is a budget line for it in order for all of us to enjoy it.
Oftentimes, some of the research we're doing at the beginning of a project, we did this in Dallas, we did this in Louisville, is figure out who are some of the partner organizations that we might get involved in the project. Here you have a conservancy that organizes a lot of that activity quite nicely. Other cities don't have that. So in Louisville, as we were talking to the client about some of their outreach, we were saying maybe there are organizations out there who are raising trees, raising food that we might begin to talk to. And for that, we ended up partnering with an organization called Louisville Grows. This is an organization that has a couple sites. They do a number of things. They have a couple sites that are urban tree farms. And what they do is they go out and buy a tree this big, so it's really cheap. And then they work with community members. A community member can come to them and say, I will tend, the agreement is, I will tend those 12, 15, 20, 50 trees over their initial lifespan. And so it gives those folks a training opportunity as they're thinking about what kind of job do I want, do I switch trade, that sort of thing. So those folks would actually tend to those trees, and then at the end of that process, the people who have been tending them can then sell the tree off to the city. The organization will help, in this case, to the client for the trees for the site. So in that case, we were finding very creative ways that weren't just about how do you maintain that landscape, but how does the landscape become a basis for people to get new opportunities in their life. In Dallas, a lot of that tree planting, some of that's already started. And again, we were partnering with a local tree organization that takes folks who are coming out of incarceration and again, giving them training opportunities. So they have some funding available. So oftentimes with these days, it's about how do you find creative partnerships in order to do that and allow other opportunities to develop out of the landscapes that we're working with. Great. Anything else? I think we're good. Oh, wait a minute. There's one more in the back. Dark. We'll do one more. Yeah, it is.
We just had an opportunity in return from London. And one of the interesting things I found was in the city of London that they have a taxation scheme. If you drive your car in during heavy traffic hours, you pay £12 to the city somehow.
Yes.
People really have changed how they drive into the city or don't drive into the city. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was a pretty good idea. Of course, I never want to pay it, but I think it's a great idea. And part two of this is, I wonder if we ought to reach the tipping point of less cars. And with the ascent of Ubers and Lyfts and people sharing zip cars and things, do you see a less car society?
Yeah, in a couple ways. In fact, I was just reading something recently, and the author was making the argument that Uber and Lyft are doing something for the way cities operate that public transit agencies couldn't do as good as public transit agencies can do. They could never get to that point of radically shifting the way people think about the use of individual automobiles. So there is hope. We're working on a project in Pittsburgh, uptown Pittsburgh, and working with some traffic consultants. And right now, of course, there are parking problems in the neighborhood. And so there's a demand for parking garages. Their public transit is okay. It's being enhanced. But our transportation folks are saying, if we do parking ramps, we have to design them in ways that in 10 years can be flipped over to some other use. Because of this revolution, folks who are 16, 18, 25 are choosing not to drive, not even to get their licenses. So you have a whole new generation of people coming in who are saying, that's not the lifestyle I want. They have opportunities with car sharing organizations. They have better bikeways. And so transportation planners and city planners now are starting to anticipate that already, that there's going to be a radical shift even within 10 years with driverless cars and all those sorts of technologies, and a cultural change where something's going to change quite significantly. So we're already starting to plan that into some of the bigger city plans that we're working on. I think it'll have a huge impact on cities for the better. So.
Hi. Yeah, I would like to ask, how do you change the discourse with politicians about climate change and urban planning? I live in Providence, and it's definitely a city that's going to see sea level rise. That's going to dramatically, and like I keep seeing all of this like demolished space and thinking, yeah, this should become a marsh. Yeah. You know, and I actually talked with the mayor, and he was just like, well, you know, support our storm water rebuilding infrastructure projects. Yep. I'm like seeing it just like fly right over his head.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'd like a suggestion, because I'd like to come back to him and.
Yeah, I mean,
Sometimes it takes the crisis. New York didn't realize there were things called hurricanes until Sandy hit, right? I mean, many other areas of the country had suffered the effects of hurricanes. But in that case, it was the crisis that prompted the political action. Here in Boston recently, because of some of those efforts, there's been a great interest in thinking through how the city adapts to climate change. And that's where partner organizations, Boston Harbor Association and others, have been involved in really raising the awareness, teaming with scientists to really bring that to the forefront, and also politically then partnering with the city in order to begin to have this discussion. And I think that's where we are in Boston right now. So it's about a number of private initiatives that are very well organized, that have brought that discussion and found a forum for that where they can share that information. So Boston is now on the cusp of starting to really adapt itself to this next wave. In other places, though, I mean, we work in Texas, right? We've done a little work in Dubai. Environmental sustainability isn't the first thing on their mind. So we sneak it in. It's not how we talk about the projects, but it's how we design the projects anyway, right? It's already there. And whether or not the politicians want to support that, what we're showing the flood engineers is actually this system works better. And down there, we work with private developers and philanthropy. So there's not a lot of strong central government to kind of lead the way. Here we're partnering with the private sector and saying, if we renovate this flood infrastructure to continue to accommodate floods but do all sorts of other things, we can actually raise land values, which is what gets the developer's interest. And if we design it in such a way, patronage will come in and support that. So there we're finding ways around city government, again, to kind of move these agendas forward, particularly in a time where, you know, Texas just doesn't have strong central government or a lot of taxes. Even here, you have municipalities that are stretched thin, right? And so the question is, how do you find creative partnerships? For us, a lot of times the question is not just what we design, but how is it that we think we're going to think this project through? How is it that we're going to create these opportunities? How is it that we're going to expand our own role as designers to take on advocacy for projects like this? And sometimes we're able to do that right through the project itself.
Great, Chris. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Sure.